What is going on, everybody? Welcome to the Cosmic Wonder. The Wall Street Journal just released a very important article that I think every Marvel fan needs to hear what they said, because they talk about how Marvel Studios has just reevaluated everything that they have done basically over the past 5 years and have decided to completely switch up everything that they are doing. This article talks about how Kevin Feige, the president of Marvel Studios, was basically pressured by Disney to create streaming content. They talk about how he was spread way too thin and many people working on shows and movies had to run in the hallways to try and find him to just get a second of his time so he could approve or disapprove or give his input on certain projects. They talk about how the people at Marvel Studios talked about Marvel and superhero fatigue. They talk about why they did everything they have done recently, including bringing Robert Downey Jr. back as Dr. Doom and making Avengers Kang Dynasty Avengers Doomsday. But most importantly, they talk about their plans moving forward. They acknowledge the issues of the past and are moving forward in a great way, and I think everybody needs to hear what is being said in this article. So let's go ahead and break it all down. The article itself is titled, "Disney Wanted More from Marvel, Now It Wants Less. The superhero studio is cutting back TV production and fixing its film slate after fans lost the plot." Now, right away, the article basically addresses and confirms what all of us fans thought all along. They state the head of Marvel Studios, speaking of Kevin Feige, told colleagues recently that watching all the comic book giants' new TV shows and films had started to feel more like homework than entertainment. The problem, Kevin Feige acknowledged, is that in an effort to satisfy parent company Disney's hunger for content on its new streaming service, the studio behind The Avengers churned out too many movies and shows with interconnected stories. The deluge of material from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or MCU, on Disney Plus overwhelmed and eventually alienated viewers. It also stretched Feige and his team's resources thin, diluting the quality of their output. Marvel's box office sales, streaming popularity, and formerly untouchable position in pop culture suffered. So, right away, Kevin Feige, the president of Marvel Studios, admits that watching everything kind of felt a little bit more like homework than entertainment, and confirmed what we all thought. Disney was pressuring Marvel Studios to simply just produce a bunch of content for Disney Plus, and naturally everything suffered for it. But here's the good news. They acknowledge this and they are now getting back on track to try to get back to old school Marvel. They state, now, Feige is leading an internal overhaul aimed at getting the studio back on track. Marvel is making fewer TV shows with standalone stories that don't require prior knowledge of the MCU. Feige is focused on fixing the studio's movie slate following recent flops like February's Captain America Brave New World. So right away, they're making less TV shows, and it sounds like now, one, the TV shows aren't going to require any prior knowledge in the MCU, meaning you won't really have to watch anything beforehand. So this is a big switch up. If you didn't watch Avengers Infinity War, Avengers Age of Ultron, and other things prior to watching WandaVision, you probably wouldn't have too much of an idea of what's going on. The same thing went for The Falcon and the Winter Soldier or Loki. If you didn't watch things before, it would be really hard to really get into the shows. So Marvel is no longer going to make shows like that. They're going to make shows that you can watch one-off. And this most likely means that they won't have too many tie-ins to big events that are happening in the MCU overall. I'm sure some of them will, but it sounds like their goal is to basically make the MCU the way it was before, with all of the movies being the things that really interconnect with one another, and then the shows can be fun one-off adventures. And yes, they will take place in the MCU, so of course they'll be connected in that sense, but it sounds like they're going to make it to where they're not absolutely necessary for the overall story in the films. Now, as far as why Marvel suffered during this time where they were producing a lot of Disney Plus content, they talk about this in great detail in the article, and it all comes down to Kevin Feige. The article has a section titled Papa Feige. In this section, they talk about how great Kevin Feige has been at starting the MCU. Basically, building up to Avengers Endgame, and with Avengers Endgame, the studio really couldn't be touched, with of course its crowning achievement being in 2019 with Avengers Endgame, with it grossing $2.8 billion, a record at the time. But here's where the problem and the decline came in after that. They state during Marvel's heyday in the 2010s, Feige was heavily involved in the film development. He deployed lower-ranking executives to supervise shooting, then got his hands dirty again in the editing room, often making significant changes and ordering new scenes. And the movies were overseen by a small team of creative executives who came to be known as the Parliament. Most had been with the company since its founding or joined as assistants and were promoted, giving Marvel a family-like culture. And they state Feige was the studio's beloved and charismatic dad, a creative genius from whom everyone sought attention and approval. So it was working great before Endgame, but this is where the problem came. They say soon after Endgame, Marvel Studios started to work on what was next for the MCU. However, Disney was working on what would be best for Disney Plus to compete with Netflix, stating that Disney needed loads of new series for it, and they were counting on Marvel to provide many of them. The strategy became just expansion, 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 said a person who worked at Marvel at the time. Kevin Feige told colleagues that he agreed to the plan because of a zealousness to tell more stories and a desire to be an excellent corporate citizen. It turned out to be a mistake. The Wall Street Journal states that Marvel's transition from producing a few hours of movie content annually to several dozen hours of streaming shows and films eventually broke down the studio's processes. A pair of executives oversaw each show, while Feige remained the final decision maker on every significant creative issue, even though there were exponentially more decisions to make each day. And here was the big problem. They state people who worked at Marvel in the early 2020s said it was challenging to secure enough time with Feige to get his feedback. As a result, they sometimes spent weeks on work that proved irrelevant once he weighed in, then found themselves with little time to implement his changes before a deadline. Desperate staffers resorted to chasing Feige in the halls to get answers. So basically what they are explaining here is that before, Kevin Feige used to look over everything. And that's because they used to only produce a few movies a year. And they actually show a graph here that shows what they produced prior to Disney Plus and then what they started to produce after. And as you can see here, it is so much more. So while Kevin Feige used to be able to look over everything, it quickly turned into he was basically looking at some things here and there, giving his input every now and then when the final product came, he demanded changes to make things better. But since there wasn't a lot of time, they really couldn't make all of the changes, and that definitely explains why the CGI for some things has been pretty sketchy. The team was asked to make changes with just not enough time to do it well. So the result was a lot of projects coming from Marvel Studios, all of which weren't the same quality that fans were used to, which brings us to the next section titled Marvel Fatigue. They state the internal dysfunction began to show in Marvel's output. Viewers complained that there was too much Marvel content to keep up with, and a growing proportionate of it felt subpar, with shows failing to attract new viewers or even old viewers with shows like Secret Invasion and Ms. Marvel. And they state that in the theaters, Marvel's biggest hits were the nostalgia stories like Spider-Man No Way Home and Deadpool and Wolverine. They then stated that they had a lot riding on Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, and then it flopped. And then employees at Marvel started to talk regularly about Marvel fatigue. They worried that they had created a no new fans club in which people unfamiliar with the state of the MCU couldn't watch a new release because they'd have no idea what was going on. Meanwhile, Wall Street's obsession with streaming growth gave way to a focus on profitability, and Bob Iger and Kevin Feige began scrutinizing Marvel's costs and creative choices more closely. This led to them deciding that Blade's script was not good enough, and they scrapped the film, for now at least. But this is where things kind of started to change. Quantumania bombed, and then Kevin Feige decided to become more involved, hoping that the Marvels wouldn't bomb. But it became Marvel's biggest bomb ever. And this is where all of the big Marvel changes come in. Marvel and Feige's Parliament team has gone to a retreat every fall in Palm Springs. They would go and they would plan out the future of the MCU. And in 2023, it was basically the worst time that they've ever gone, with Marvel not being in such good shape. The TV shows weren't working, the movies weren't working, and the studio had just laid off employees for the first time in its history. From here, they talked about whether or not they could salvage their plans for Kang Dynasty, with Quantumania being such a bomb, and talked about a new TV strategy in which shows would have plots divorced from the MCU, making them easier for new fans to understand. And this led to a bunch of changes that Marvel Studios then made and are continuing to make now. They decided to cut back significantly on TV production. And Disney CEO Bob Iger even said, "Quantity in our case diluted quality," and Marvel has suffered greatly from that. And now they're only going to release 1 or 2 live-action streaming series annually, starting in 2026, with the goal of the new shows they introduce to have multiple seasons and not cross over onto the big screen. And the primary reason that they are doing this is so Feige can focus on the movies, and they're even going to have a senior executive overseeing television, which as far as we're concerned, I believe that is Brad Winderbaum, head of Marvel TV. Marvel's top priority is ensuring that the next 2 Avengers extend the track record of the franchise. So Marvel decided to brainstorm on how they could make Avengers Kang Dynasty better, and it just so happened that at that time, Kevin Feige had been talking to Robert Downey Jr. for more than a year about returning to the MCU to specifically play Doctor Doom. They just didn't know when or where he could return and appear in the MCU. But as they started to think about what to do for Kang Dynasty, they ultimately decided that Robert Downey Jr. was the solution to their so-called Avengers problem. So they changed Avengers Kang Dynasty to Avengers Doomsday and announced that Robert Downey Jr. would be returning to play Doom. And they don't mention this, but I'm sure the fact that Jonathan Majors got into all of the trouble that he did made it pretty easy to move away from Kang, on top of already beginning to think about moving away from Kang. Then on top of that, they hired the Russo brothers to come back for the next 2 Avengers films as well, stating that Kevin Feige likes to go back to people he trusts, particularly in moments of urgency, which I would definitely say that Marvel was in. So Marvel Studios has a completely new plan moving forward, and the article ends actually by stating, in many ways, Marvel has now reverted to its strategy from before the streaming boom, as if the past 5 years had been a bad dream. As he did when Marvel Studios started, Feige has an expansive vision for his company's big screen future. The upcoming Avengers movies are expected to introduce the X-Men, one of Marvel's most popular superhero teams, to the MCU. Feige has told colleagues he has a 10-year plan for the characters. So, huge news for us Marvel fans. Marvel Studios is basically going back to how they did it in the Infinity Saga. And the phrase "in Feige we trust" does come to mind because when Feige can directly oversee projects and give time to those projects, that's when they're good. And now Marvel Studios has a head of television to where Feige doesn't really have to be involved, which means now, and this is their plan, he can completely focus on movies. And this is going to make a really big difference for both TV and movies, because now Brad Winderbaum can make all the decisions for TV shows, and he can make them pretty much right away when they need to be made. This will lead to things not being done at the last minute, and the same thing goes for movies. Kevin Feige can be involved the entire time. So instead of the creative team working on something for weeks and then Kevin Feige coming in and saying, "Nope, that doesn't work, start over or do something else," that's not the case anymore. He can be with them when they begin and either say, "Yes, this is good," or "No, it's not, let's go a different direction." This is going to really just improve the quality of all of the projects coming from Marvel Studios a ton. So their new strategy, combined with the X-Men now coming to our new universe after Secret Wars and the Fantastic Four and whoever else they get to appear, is going to mean Marvel Studios is going to be at its very best after Avengers Secret Wars. But really, hopefully, starting with the Fantastic Four and Avengers Doomsday and Secret Wars, that should be the best for Marvel Studios as well, because they're already doing their new plan. Feige has been way more involved with these projects than he's been in the last 5 years. So hopefully they are fantastic. I think this is great news, but go ahead, let me know what you think about all of this in the comments down below. Please don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss out on any of the latest Marvel news, rumors, or leaks. You can catch us on TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, and Facebook. And as always, thank you all so much for watching. Woof woof.